Greetings, my scattered brothers and sisters in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that his presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. Well, we are with Jesus. We're in Mark chapter 15, and Jesus is before Pilate, and Pilate is about to hand him over to be crucified. And so I'll pick it up at Mark chapter 15, beginning at verse 6. Now at the feast, Pilate used to release for them one prisoner from whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him up. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus or whipped him, he delivered him to be crucified. Now, few things are pretty interesting here. The feast that they're talking about is the Passover feast. And this feast was the celebration of how God liberated Israel from Egypt, brought them out of bondage, out of slavery, and eventually into the promised land. But the Passover celebrated their release, their redemption from Egypt. And so Pilate, wanting to do kind of a political favor, at the feast, he would liberate a prisoner for them. And so somebody that he had arrested, somebody that had been kind of a social rebel that the Romans had incarcerated, Pilate, as a kind gesture, would liberate them. And so it's a feast of liberation, and Pilate, wanting to keep them happy, liberates someone for them. Meanwhile, he's got them firmly under his control, making sure that there's no disorder, and you kind of get the picture. So Pilate is someone that tries to keep people happy while at the same time keeping them under his thumb, keeping them under his rule, and keeping the emperor satisfied that all is well in the territory that he's governor over. So we see that going on and kind of the irony of that. And then Pilate wants to actually release Jesus to them. He realizes Jesus isn't a threat. He knows that Jesus is kind of popular with the crowd. And so he's thinking, okay, I can gain even more political favor. I'll release King Jesus to them. He's not a threat to the emperor. No worry about letting him go. And the thing that Pilate wasn't expecting was that the Jewish leadership would be able to turn the crowd against Jesus. He's probably thinking this is the same crowd that celebrated Jesus as king when he rode into Jerusalem. This is the same crowd that has been amazed at Jesus' teaching in the temple. So he's probably thinking that he's going to use the crowd to his advantage and actually kind of put the Jewish leadership in check. But he miscalculated. And the Jewish authorities were able to turn the crowd against Jesus, and so that they're crying out that Barabbas, the murderer, would be released, and Jesus, the peacemaker, that he would be the one who was going to be crucified. And so they're shouting to crucify him, crucify him. Pilate knows that Jesus hasn't done anything deserving crucifixion. He tells the crowd this, and yet the Jewish leadership stirred up the crowd even more, and they're crying out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And so what does Pilate do? He gives in to the crowd. He wants to please the crowd. And as he pleases the crowd, he has Jesus handed over. He hands Jesus over to his guards to be whipped and to be crucified. Listen to that line again. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered Jesus to be crucified. Pilate, not really a leader, just somebody that's always trying to keep everybody happy. And so wanted to keep them happy by releasing a prisoner to them, wanted to keep the crowd happy by releasing Jesus to them. He miscalculated. And so now, wanting to keep the crowd happy, wanting to satisfy them, he sentences Jesus to crucifixion. All because of the crowd. When I think about this, I can't help but wonder how often we try to please the crowd instead of actually staying loyal to Jesus, staying faithful to Jesus as our King and Lord. And yeah, we like to please people. We like to try to keep as many people happy as we can. But when that becomes kind of our main motivation, is pleasing everyone, keeping everyone happy, satisfying the crowd, then we're going to end up doing what Pilate just did. We are going to sentence Jesus to be crucified all over again. Our calling is to be faithful to Jesus. And that may mean that we don't please everybody, but Jesus is the one who is Lord. Jesus is the one who is worthy of our full and complete obedience. And so God help us not to be like Pilate, to where we betray Jesus, turn Jesus over, reject Jesus, all because we're trying to satisfy the crowd, even when we know that Jesus is actually worthy of our lives. Well, that's the word for today. Don't be like Pilate. Be faithful to Jesus. Don't worry about the crowds. Fix your eyes on Jesus. Follow him.